What is going on, gun fighters? Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the art and the science of shooting the right way with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Today, we're going to be talking about copper bullets. I should also mention a short preamble before I put in the bio, because the bio, I don't record the bio every single time. I have one or a couple different ones pre-recorded that I plug in, because I don't like talking about myself like that much. But I think it's important why you, especially for new listeners that haven't heard it a bunch, because if you've heard it, you can just fast forward, why you should care what I have to say on a topic, on a subject. Why should you care? And it's not because I have a microphone, not because I have a podcast, not because I shoot watermelons on YouTube or whatever. That's all fine, but that's entertainment. Why should you care and put any weight in my thoughts or opinions on a subject? God has blessed me to have many experiences, which I try and use to serve you guys. That's why I put in the bio. But what I'm doing now, for years I tried to make the podcast a full-time income, and I'll take responsibility as to why that didn't happen. But I dug through savings, cashed out some retirement, cashed out some Bitcoin, and it was time to start saving money again. So I took a job as a private security contractor. And I moved for the job because I've done private security contracting work in the past, and without getting too much of what I'm doing, working for the feds, most of that is full-time work. But I found a job that said that I could do part-time, so I moved for the job. And it has not been, and I'm not complaining, but it's not been as part-time as I thought it would be. That said, why I'm bringing that up now is today's audio quality is not going to be all peaches and cream here. It's going to vary. There's going to be some foibles and variances in audio quality. It just is what it is. You're just going to have to make like a pickle and deal with it. With that, I'm going to plug in the bio, and then we'll get talking about copper. I'll roll into a quick abbreviated bio and then into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one in my life. I grew up hunting and fishing in the backwoods of the southeastern United States at a very early age. Some of my earliest memories are with firearms. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. By God's grace, He got me through that safely. After that, I served as an instructor, an urban warfare instructor and a desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. I also served with the LAPD, both full-time as a sworn police officer and some more specialized assignments, as well as serving in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. I've been a FBI firearms instructor, still am an FBI firearms instructor, have been for a lot of years, also NRA certified and some other three-letter government agency certified. I've been a private contractor for a three-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. By God's grace, He got me through all that in one piece, not because I'm better, but because He chose to have grace and mercy on me. I've been a professional hunter and guide. Professionally hunted things like buffalo and elk. Not many people today can say they've done that, but I'm blessed to be able to say that I have. I've hunted everything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast, and elk and bear and wolf, and slain all manner of beast. A state rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different disciplines. Now those experiences, it's not because I'm bigger or badder, certainly not bigger. In fact, I met one of the patrons in real life, and he said something to the effect of, "I thought you'd be bigger." Reminded me of that William Wallace movie, where he's like, "Oh yeah, if William Wallace were here, he'd shoot lightning bolts out of his rear end." Well, I'm not William Wallace, but I am the person that did all those things in the bio. But not because I'm bigger or badder. I don't think that I survived when many other young, good men did not. I give all the glory and all the credit to God, all the talents and experiences that He's given me and the things that He's let me live through. I hope to use them to glorify God and to help you today. So if I boast in anything, it's not in my strength. It's in that God had mercy on me and saved me because he had a purpose for me. And hopefully I can use those talent, skills, and abilities to serve you today. All right. Copper is not new. It's come on strong recently, though. Even the military, for the M16, M4, AR-15 pattern rifle, their new load, the M855A1, is not solid copper, but it's lead-free. So many different directions I could go here. We could talk about the environmental aspect. You got to save the condors, man. We could talk about my experience with copper, which I guess we'll start there. So I started in sometime in the aughts, and I forget exactly when, loading copper, reloading for copper, and not mostly for the environmental aspect. I started doing it because I wanted to mess around with it and check out the attributes of copper bullets, especially for hunting. And that was in the that was sometime in the 2000s. Maybe the early 2010s. I don't honestly remember. It's a long time ago when I started actually messing with copper seriously. And that's not when copper first became a thing, but that's kind of like the first generation, and that's 2013. I just looked it up. It says is when copper bullets were mandated in California. Now, that's for animals, that's for hunting. You can shoot a person with lead, that's cool. But you'd better not shoot an animal with lead. That's just cruel and unusual punishment or something. Whatever. It smells of infringement. Let's put it that way. But I don't want to get bogged down into that. We're mostly going to stick today on the attributes of copper, not the environmental, OSHA, EPA kind of aspects of it. We're going to talk about the characteristics of it, because it's not just for hippies who hunt in Birkenstocks and wear patchouli in California. It's a real thing, and it has different attributes and different aspects that even if you're not mandated to, you may decide that you want to. But let's talk about the non-toxic nature of this ammo. First of all, I care less about condors than I do about people. How much more value are you than many sparrows? So, it's non-toxic for you, and you may or may not care about that. Now, I grew up putting meat on the table with a gun. I've eaten I don't know how many animals that have been shot with lead, and I think even if you shoot an animal with lead ammo, that is still probably healthier than meat you buy at the store wrapped in cellophane that was pumped full of all kinds of stuff, standing around in its own feces. Call me crazy. But you can still hunt and not use lead ammo. So, there is that. It is non-toxic. And if that really bothers you, or you have a high lead level anyway, you work with lead paint. I have had my lead levels tested, you might imagine from my bio, and they're fine. I don't worry too much about it. And again, lifelong experience with that. But if you have a high lead exposure, or you have, high lead levels anyway, you work at an indoor shooting range, whatever the case is, you may decide for you. It's not my place to decide for you. I don't think it's anybody's place to decide for you. Not mine, and not any. Anyway, I'm going to get off that soapbox. But you decide for you. But that is a real characteristic I wanted to touch on. And again, I care less about condors than I do about human health. And it's less toxic than lead is. So, and I say less because unless you're using some kind of special primers still have heavy metals and toxic metals and stuff like that in them. But either way, the projectile itself is less going to give you heavy metal issues. So that's a real thing for people, and that's something as a hunter you may want to consider. That is a real attribute that has nothing to do with terminal performance. It's just a health issue that you should weigh for yourself as a sovereign individual human being as to whether or not you care about that, or you should care about that. Do your own research. Make up your own thoughts and opinions on that. I'm not so vain as to think that you should agree with me on that. All right, as Weird Al would say, let's get white and nerdy here, talking about attributes. And I actually heard that song for the first time this year in a private security contracting set of courses. Even though it's an older song, I just heard it. But let's get nerdy here. The atomic weight of copper is 63.546. The atomic weight of lead is 207.2. What does that mean to you as a tactical shooter, as a hunter? Probably nothing. But if you wanted to get really nerdy. Now, here's the density of lead per cubic inch. Because the heck with the metric system. We're Americans. So, per cubic inch. And it doesn't really matter the unit of measurement. You'll get the idea here. Lead density, 0.0409 pounds. So let's just call 0.4 something pounds. Density of copper per cubic inch, 0.3 of a pound. This is where you might start getting into some real world applicability for you, the shooter. But it's not that simple, because a lot of times when you're shooting lead, you're not shooting pure lead. And when you're shooting copper, you're not shooting pure copper. You're shooting some kind of alloy, some kind of amalgamation of different elements, whether it be lead and tin, lead and linotite, copper and tin, which makes brass, some formulation of gilding metal. So it's probably not that pure. You're probably not shooting like 0.999 or 99.999% copper or 99.999% lead. You're probably shooting some, again, amalgamation of different elements, but it's mostly copper and mostly lead, which is why you may hear them referred to as solid copper, even though they're probably not, or mono metal, even though they're probably not. There probably some variation thereof, but to get the idea. And if you looked at those numbers, you may come up with a quick calculation in your head that a copper bullet of the same size is going to be roughly 0.75, 0.8, 0.85 in weight as a lead bullet of the same size. Let me give you a for instance if you're still having trouble picturing that, because audio is not the best format for some of this stuff. But let's say you have your classic 150 grain 308 load. A bullet of roughly the same size is probably going to weigh around 130 grains. Even though it's the same size, because copper is less dense than lead. It's probably not exact, but if you do some quick math and you look at those densities per cubic inch, then, and I might have said square inch, but per cubic inch, you get the idea. Those densities will be fairly similar. And again, none of this is exact because of different elements and things, different bullet shapes, because copper bullets have to be shaped different than lead cup and core bullets. So, again, if you're talking about your classic 150 grain 308, and I'm just picking because it's a pretty vanilla standard load, you're probably looking at a 130 grain solid copper of about the same size. Where this may give you some issues is if you are right on that ragged edge of being able to stabilize a bullet. Let's say you go really heavy for caliber. Let's say you're trying to stabilize a 200 grain, I don't even think they make it, but I'm just throwing it out there. Let's say you're trying to stabilize and you're barely stabilizing a 200 grain 308 load, which you could, I don't know of any commercial loads, but I used to hand load that very load, 200 grain hot cores. Let's say that you're on the ragged edge of stabilizing that bullet, 200 grain in a 308. Probably not stabilizing a 200 grain copper bullet, if they even make one, which I don't think they do, because it's going to be bigger, it's going to be longer, and your twist rate of your barrel doesn't have to do with weight, although we often mention it that way. It has to do with the length of the bullet, and a copper bullet of the same weight is going to be bigger, which means it's going to be longer because it can't be fatter because it has to be the same diameter, right? So it has to be longer. So where you could run into issues of stability, the one place you might run into this is something like a 22, because 22 has a vast range of twist rates, especially in the AR platform, For instance, a lot of the more modern ARs are going to be 1 and 9, 1 and 8, 1 and 7, and they'll stabilize a 77 grain bullet, which is a far cry from the original 55 grain bullet. But if they do make a 77 grain 22 bullet in copper, you may or may not stabilize that bullet. So that's just one thing to be considerate of. Another property of lead versus copper, and again, this is not exact because we're not dealing with pure copper and pure lead, but if you look at hardness, malleability, it's different. Lead is a very soft metal compared to copper. And again, this may vary, but if we consider lead hardness on the Rockwell scale in the 30s, copper in the 40 to 50. It's harder. What does this mean? It means it doesn't have as much give to it, and you are with a controlled explosion. Let's keep that in mind. That's what a rifle does, right, or a handgun does. With a controlled explosion, you are forcibly forcing that bullet, because if you try and put that bullet, if you take a bullet out of a cartridge and try and put it down the front end of your rifle, it doesn't fit down the barrel, right? That's not how that works if you didn't know. That bullet is bigger than the barrel itself, gets forced into shape. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very accurate and gases would escape around it. And it'd be all kinds of crazy stuff going on. That bullet has to get forced into the shape of that barrel. Just a little bit, maybe thousandths of an inch, but it still gets swaged down. It still gets compressed, forced into that shape so it's really tight, literally airtight, going down that barrel. Well, we just determined that lead, which if we're talking about even copper jacketed lead bullets, which is your traditional, jacketed full metal jacket or soft point or hollow point bullet, generally has copper around it, but the inside, for a non-scientific term, has more squish to it, right? It squishes down, it swages down, it compresses down easier than copper by the very characteristics of the elements themselves. So that could give you potential issues with copper. Copper, even though many lead bullets are completely copper jacketed, especially if you talk about a rifle or a handgun and modern things, most modern cartridges, the entire bullet's going to be coated in copper or, again, some kind of gilding metal. Even though that's the case, you're probably, because of the characteristics we aforementioned, going to get more copper fouling with a copper bullet because it has less give. Now, one of the ways they get around that, and I don't know of any, at least rifle bullets that don't do this, is they cut grooves into the bullet. And I don't mean in the front like those crazy new screwdriver bullets. I'm talking about they may cut bands around the bullet so that you don't have the entire surface of the bullet with the entire surface contact of the barrel. That should aid in or reduce copper fouling, but that is something to be aware of just by the very difference in the metals themselves. Also, if you are into the survival aspect, which I am, I started casting lead when I was a young lad. My entry into reloading started very early. Probably CPS would have gotten called if they'd have seen me playing with molten lead at the ages that I was. But the point of that is that lead melts at a pretty low temperature. It's a pretty low melting temperature. Lead melting temperature is somewhere in the 600 degree range, 621.5 to be more exact. Melting point, and I wasn't sure, but I knew it was higher, but it's a lot higher. Melting point for copper is 1,982.32 degrees Fahrenheit, so almost 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot more than 600 and something. Right, so that to say, you're probably not just making a campfire on a long hunt and casting some more copper bullets like you would lead. That's a pretty small portion of people that cast their own lead bullets, but people still do it, 4570, 357, 38 special, things like that. People do cast lead bullets pretty routinely. You're probably, unless you have a lot more infrastructure, copper is a different ballgame, let's just put it that way. Okay, now I had an original chunk of content recorded. What I'm going to do is plug that in here, and then I got some questions from the patrons on copper specifically, which we will get into at the end. So the audio quality will be a little bit less than it is now, and then it'll come back. So hopefully you'll be patient and you care more about the content than the audio quality. Hey guys, I thought I would do a quick just summation of copper. I did that survey, you guys might remember, on Patreon, and I had a list of things about copper. And by far the biggest category is people that were curious about copper. So that's what I'm here to do, is here to help serve you guys. And I have a bit of experience with copper, not the most experience with copper, but probably 10-ish years ago, I started messing around with copper. Started reloading for copper, and I still have some copper ammo, still use it from time to time. I have carried it in the past as carry ammo for a handgun. So what's the deal with this copper ammo? Monometal, monolithic. It's probably, none of those are actually probably, well, I don't know which monometal, monolithic, solid copper. They're not probably solid copper. I mean, nothing is 100% pure. Even like really pure gold or silver is like 99.9, right? So it's not pure copper, but you get the idea. And a lot of times it's a copper alloy. It's a gilding metal. You'll hear that term, like gilding metal, or it's some amalgamation of different elements, mostly copper. So you might hear it referred to as copper, monolithic, monometal. It refers to basically the same thing. And different companies likely will use different mixtures for different things, or just that's their mixture. So you guys know me, I'm not really brand loyal, and I don't take any sponsors or anything, but Barnes is like the standard for copper bullets. Barnes has been making, I think they probably make the most copper bullets. They make certainly the most widely known, at least hunting copper bullets, and that's going to be the Barnes TSX and TTSX now for triple shock and tipped triple shock. There are other companies, but again, those are kind of the big guys. They're kind of like the Nike of running shoes as far as copper bullets go. So here's the deal. Copper bullets are really, really good bullets. In general, especially high quality ones, but as you might imagine, they can be kind of expensive. But they give you a little bit of performance if that's what you're looking for. Here's one of the main things I want you to take away from copper bullets is they don't play by the same rules as other bullets. So just kind of throw out anything that you think that you know about how bullets perform, because copper plays by its own rules. Even the weights, right? So a copper bullet, if you think about it logically, a copper bullet, let's say a 308 150 grain, a copper bullet is going to be a lot bigger than a 150 grain lead cup and core bullet or lead jacketed cup and core bullet, because copper is less dense than lead, right? So you're going to need different twist rates. Now most 308s, if they'll twist, they'll usually twist 150 grain, 160 something grain copper bullet just fine, because they'll twist 180 grain or maybe even heavier grain bullet in a 308. But you got to be careful if you're pushing that ragged edge. That's another thing. I guess we won't even talk about hand loading copper bullets. That's its own thing. You load them different. You especially load them different with being off the lands. You wouldn't just load them to the same length that you would load a lead bullet, and I'll leave it at that for now. But as far as you buying copper bullets or copper ammunition, it kind of plays by its own rules as far as grain weight, and you don't really need, in my opinion, the same grain weight. So I would actually step it down, because again, they play by their own rules, and they generally hold together unless they're actually designed to come apart, which some are. They generally hold together and they drive deep. And one of their other attributes, they can be very accurate because they are one solid monolithic thing. If you get into some of the upper end ones, are actually turned on a lathe, so they can be very, very accurate. one of the caveats, and this, I haven't seen this personally, but I've heard this, and it's from somebody a source that I really trust, Ron Spomer, who's probably shot a lot more different copper ammunition than I have. And he says, and I think I've heard it from somebody else too, Joseph Von Benedict. Anyway, those guys, although I don't always agree with them, they know what they're talking about when it comes to hunting bullets. And they say that you really should clean down to bare metal if you're going from regular traditional ammunition to copper ammunition for accuracy for some reason that I don't understand. I haven't seen that to be the case, but they have said that. So, you might want to look into that. You might not want to just shoot regular lead ammo and then shoot copper and see how it shoots. You might want to clean your bore down to basically, squeaky clean and then start again with copper. I don't really understand why that is, but I've heard it, and those guys, I kind of trust what they say as far as things like that. So you might at least want to look at that. Now, I haven't really seen bad accuracy, but also maybe if I cleaned it down to bare metal when I switched over, then I would see even greater accuracy. So who knows? On the fact that they drive deep and they're very accurate, and I would step down in grain weight, going back to that. So one of the reasons I started doing the copper bullets, I went to 130 grain 308 load. And if you look at the numbers on 130 grain 308 load, that is a very, very impressive load. And I think it gives performance probably greater than 150, 168 grain loads in traditional cup and core bullets. It does come at a cost. It does come at a very literal cost. So I would really only do that if I was kind of looking to step up in performance. Your traditional cup and core bullets, unlike a 308, 150 grain for deer and even elk, or 168 grain for deer or elk, those bullets are going to be fine. They're going to, if you put the bullet where it's supposed to go, they should do just fine. That's it. If you're trying to step up in performance, and or the big one for me, if you're going to hunt with a marginal caliber, I would really look at the solid coppers. I'm not saying you have to hunt with solid coppers, but if you're going to hunt deer with something like a 223 or a 300 blackout, or hunt bigger bodied game, or want a different shot angles with like a 243, I would really look at stepping up to copper. If you were going to hunt a bigger animal, not that you have to, but it wouldn't be bad to look at copper. Just because copper, it penetrates really, really well. It holds together really well. It holds its integrity well. So again, they just kind of play by different rules. They're going to be bigger, even though they're generally lighter than lead. So either look at it like 150 grain, 308 copper bullet is going to be bigger than 150 grain lead bullet, or look at it as in a similar sized bullet is going to weigh less than the lead bullet. Either way, they play by their own rules. They have their own kind of quirks, but that's just because we're so used to lead. They're not worse. They're just different. In a lot of ways, they're better. In some ways, they're not. And one of the big ones is cost, right? Generally, they're going to cost you more than a comparable cup and core bullet. So if you like to practice and shoot a lot, as I do, you may want a dedicated copper load and switch to it for hunting season or something like that. But they can be quite expensive, so just be aware of that. Anyway, just some quick thoughts on copper bullets. With that, guys, I appreciate you. Part of Psalm 91, you shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor the destruction that lays waste at noonday. 1,000 may fall at my side, 10,000 at my right hand, but it shall not come near me. With that, guys, have a blessed day. As aforementioned, coming back in with some questions from Patreon on copper. Now, with that said, why don't you become a patron? There's a lot of really cool content on there. Commercial-free, ad-free, support the podcast, all the buzzwords. Small business, American, veteran-owned, gluten-free, all the stuff, right? Consider going out and checking out Patreon. Most of that stuff's for members, for patrons, but a lot of that stuff on there, there's quite a few things on there that are just you can just look at without joining. Don't have to give any credit card information. Why don't you check it out? There should be a link in the show notes. Anyway, let's answer some of these questions that came again from Patreon. If it's so good, why are they not in use before bans took effect? Yeah, that's a good question. One is cost, right? They cost more. So that's a big one. Another one is sometimes you have happy coincidences. Like maybe sometime you're doing something for one thing, but you get something else really cool out of it. That happens a lot with inventions. Just look up a list of like accidental inventions like Teflon or silly putty or a bunch of stuff like that. So even though you may not be mandated, even though I don't like that it came out of a mandate, that doesn't mean that the bullet themselves are really bad. I think copper bullets, to be fair, were around before the ban was a thing. That certainly helped them out because California, the largest state by population, they had to hunt with them. So that probably helped spur innovation. I'm not going to lie, but copper bullets predate the ban. We mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, California, I think, was the first state to mandate it, and they mandated it in 2013. Just Barnes alone, Monolithic bullet came out in 1986. The Barnes X bullet in 1986. That's a long time before 2013. So I don't think that the premise is actually 100% right, but I get the gist of what you're trying to say. That definitely spurred a big push in a lot of people looking into copper that otherwise wouldn't have. They just had no choice. And of course, when you get that kind of forced thing, you do get more competition in that. So I'm not saying the mandate is a good thing. I'm not saying I agree with it. But what I'm saying is just because one state mandates it and your state doesn't mean that it's not a good choice. And it doesn't mean that copper bullets aren't better at some things and worse at other things. But a very good question. Are they cost effective? Well, I mean, compared to what? Compared to lead, no. They're more expensive. Cost effective, I mean, if my elk tag cost me $39 and I use one bullet to take that elk and that bullet cost me $3 and I get 600 pounds of meat for $3, yeah, I'd call that cost effective. If you're going out to bang steel at a range or put holes in paper, I mean, it makes more sense to shoot lead or traditional, jacketed bullets. So, cost effective per what? But no, certainly, and I think probably for the time being, unless there's some fundamental upset in manufacturing or the cost of the metals themselves, copper's probably going to be more expensive. Or the copper alloy bullets and a lead alloy bullet. Even if both elements, copper and lead, had exactly the same spot price, which is like the raw cost of the metal, even if they did, we mentioned in the beginning that copper has a much, much higher melting temperature. So that means more energy, which means the cost of that bullet to be made is going to be more. Again, unless there's some fundamental shift in how they're made. And I know that some of those model metal bullets are literally spun and lathed out, turned on a lathe. But I got to imagine that's not any cheaper. I could be wrong. I'm not a metallurgist. I'm not a manufacturer. But they do cost more. It just depends on if the attributes they bring to the table are worth it for you. Do they cycle in semi-autos reliably? Yeah, they should cycle as good as anything else, as assuming that your gun likes them. Now, certain guns like different things. A good example of this is a 22. You could have the 1022 has been around for a long time, and you have who knows how many millions of 1022s made. You could have 1022s that look almost identical from the outside, but one could prefer one load and one could prefer another load. One could be completely reliable. Well, nothing's completely reliable, but you get the point. One can be really reliable with Remington Thunderbolts, and the next 1022 could hate Remington Thunderbolts and like CCI mini mags. So that to say, there's nothing inherently different about the copper loads themselves. Like CCI mini mag has a solid copper load, or I shouldn't say solid copper, but a mono metal, copper type load. I wouldn't say that one's any more or less apt to feed in a 22 than their regular CCI mini mag. Just to throw that out, because 22s can be fairly finicky. There's nothing inherent about the design that should mean that they are any less reliable in a semi-auto. If they're loaded to a similar pressure, if they have a similar bullet profile, most of that just comes down to the preferred diet of the gun in question. You're talking about handguns, the bullet profile plays a lot into that, especially older handguns. So that really just depends. But there's nothing, again, inherently less reliable in feeding unless there's just something with bullet geometry. But that's not inherent to the copper. That would just be the design of the bullet. So as reliable as probably any other load. Nothing inherently less reliable about copper in semi-autos. This one is not per se about copper, but it ties in because a lot of these projectiles are kind of copper or some kind of composite that's not lead. External hollow points, and I don't think hollow points is the right word, but I know what he means. He means the screwdriver rounds. Do they work as advertised? Do they do anything better than traditional JHPs, cartridges, Lehigh, G9? He's talking about those Phillips head screwdriver type rounds. You probably know what the asker is asking about. Do they work as good as traditional JHPs? I'm going to go out on a limb and say they're way less proven, right? I don't see a lot of departments, a lot of big agencies, the military. I don't see them in mass jettisoning, traditional jacketed hollow point rounds with all that research and all that R&D for these kind of rounds. It may get there, but I would not say they're better. No, if they were better, they've been around a while. If they were better, everybody would be jettisoning traditional jacketed hollow points and embracing these. There are some uses of them, and the best one I could think of would a really good case for this may be like a 380. A 380 is kind of on that ragged edge of enough power to expand and penetrate well. Well, these bullets don't expand. So in a 380, you might really find a load of these screwdriver rounds, is what I'm going to call them, that you might prefer to a traditional jacketed hollow point, because when a bullet's diameter increases, its ability to penetrate decreases. That's how that works. And a lot of times that's a good thing. But in a marginal caliber, and I'm going to call 380 a marginal caliber, you may find, again, this is where these attributes make sense. They might drive deeper than your traditional jacketed lead hollow point, and that's a good thing in a 380. So in that instance, yeah, they might be better. They might be better. You have to test it. Don't just take my word for it and start carrying those rounds. But there's a case where it might be. In general, though, I'd say right now in 2024, you're probably better with a good proven self-defense hollow point, a Winchester Ranger T, a Spear Gold Dot, etc. Anything really good street proven, because you don't want to be a beta tester in a gunfight. What kind of flight characteristics can one expect from copper rifle ammo compared to lead jacketed? So we're talking about external ballistics, what the bullet does between the time it leaves the barrel to the time it impacts the target. Well, we mentioned that in general, for the same size, they're going to be lighter, and they're going to penetrate deeply. So if you're a traditional, I shouldn't say traditional, if you hunt with maximum point blank range, if that's your bread and butter, if that's what you do, these may give you a distinct advantage. This may be a part, maybe, depending on your caliber and how you hunt and if your gun even likes them. And this is one of the reasons I started loading for them, because that's one of the ways that I like to hunt. And I mentioned a 308, right? If you look at the velocity of what you can get 130 grain TSX, or now the TTSX, what you can get that screaming. It's a fast load in 130 grain in a 308 compared to other loads. And it can increase your max point blank range. And because it's copper and it holds together better, it can drive deep and penetrate well. So I got no problem with that on bigger game. A solid copper, even on elk, 130 grain. 130 grain on elk. I'm telling you, solid copper plays by different rules. So you can load, let's say, because you're talking about staying safe, your max cup or your max PSI, pounds per square inch, is pretty set. You don't have to load to that, but there's a max that you can safely go to. If you load a lighter bullet, you can load to a faster velocity. which if you're talking about shooting with a rangefinder and dialing dope, that's not really an advantage. But if you're talking about max point blank range, that is an advantage. And the deep penetration. So you can load a lighter bullet to a faster velocity, therefore giving you a longer max point blank range. So in that, it's an advantage. You're talking about shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor and dialing dope with your fancy rangefinder and your computer and your giant obese, 30, 34 millimeter scope and dialing a bunch of dope and doing all that. No, it's not an advantage there. Your ballistic coefficient, your ability of the bullet to fly through the air is generally going to be better on your traditional, like Berger, War Hornady ELD type bullets than a copper bullet. So they're different is what I'm getting at. It may be better for you. It may not be. It's not as cut as dry as, oh yeah, they're better at everything. They're not. They're better at some things. They're worse at others. It just depends on what you want to do. For self-defense, and I've said this many times, for your carry handgun, if you're talking about carrying these rounds, they're different. Their mass is different. Their velocity is probably different. So are they going to shoot same point of aim, point of impact in your carry gun as your lead practice ammo? Probably not. Right? So you probably should test that. You might find some overlap. If you shoot a lightweight for caliber like 115 grain and a heavyweight for caliber like 115 grain and a copper in a 9mm, you may find some crossover. You may find one that shoots the same point of aim, point of impact. May being the key word. But they're likely going to have different flight characteristics. They're likely going to have different external ballistics. So you need to look into that depending on your application. They're different is what I'm saying. If you get that crossover where the bullet's roughly the same size, same shape on a handgun, and again, you're shooting 115 grain copper and 115 grain lead, the bullet shapes are going to be different. You may or may not run into feeding issues. You may or may not have the same point of aim, point of impact. But it's possible, at least at practical handgun ranges. Next one, not really a question. I'm more interested in flatter trajectory for tighter max point blank range without the loss of terminal effect than the alleged extra stopping power. Thanks. Yeah, that, and we actually just touched on that. So yeah, that's possibly a thing for you, and depending on your caliber. And the next one is barrel and land wear. Now, I don't know. This is a question I don't know the answer to. I don't think they're bad for a barrel in the same way that I would consider, cheap garbage Russian bimetal jacketed bullet, because if you don't know, it's not just a steel in a lot of those. It's not just a steel case. It's actually a steel jacket on the bullet with some kind of copper chemical wash that makes it look like a real bullet. I mean, it's a real bullet. It'll kill you, but they're garbage. And if you think about, ripping steel down a steel barrel, bad. Now, I don't think copper bullets are inherently bad for a gun. And again, these bullets are fairly expensive. And if you're talking about a traditional caliber like .308, let's say that I don't know if that would be more or less barrel life with solid copper bullets like a Barnes TSX. I honestly don't know, and I don't know anybody that's actually done that. But those are expensive bullets. If you're running, 5,000 rounds of TSX bullets through that gun, then it might become an issue. But I don't think you're going to be shooting that many solid copper bullets through that kind of gun, through like a traditional hunting rifle. Except if you are a big-time shooter, you're probably going to practice, and then before hunting season, clean out your barrel and switch to your copper load, and then, do a little bit of practice with it. If you're talking about the military's new M855A1, that actually does, I think, have more wear on barrels from what I've heard. And it's not been around long enough to be sure, but it may wear out barrels faster if we're talking about like an AR. But there's some other issues in there. I think it's loaded to higher pressure. It also has a really hard tip on the bullet, which can tear up feed ramps, which the bullet tip there is not copper. So the answer to that is I don't know. If you're talking about like common calibers, a 9mm, a .308, a .270, I don't think it's going to be an issue. What may be more of an issue is how often you have to clean it. You may go several hundred rounds in a .308 before you have to worry about copper fouling. Now, you still might want to clean it out, powder fouling, things like that. But we're talking about stripping the copper out of the bore, which I generally like to leave it in there anyway because it'll shoot different once you strip it out. But you may get to a point where that copper buildup changes your accuracy, either changes point of aim, point of impact, or just widens it, makes it bigger, you may get to that point faster, and I don't know the answer to that. That may be an issue with the solid coppers, and I've not shot enough of them. I've not shot like 100 rounds of cup and core and 100 rounds of solid copper side by side in the same gun after completely stripping the bore and seeing how much the groups open up. I haven't done that, but I don't think that they're inherently bad for a barrel. You may have to clean it more often, but copper fouling is not destroying the barrel. You probably destroy it more by cleaning it too much and pouring ammonia down there and leaving it too long than the copper actually hurts the bore, unless you get so much of it that it becomes an issue. That's a lot of rounds. And as far as wearing out a barrel faster, I mean, if you're talking about like a 220 Swift and just screaming velocities, maybe. I don't even know that I would say. I would just say it's possible, but in most common calibers for most practical uses, I would say probably not an issue. Anyway, some really good questions. Thank you to the Patreon page, and thank you to everybody that steps up and supports the podcast. I appreciate all that you do. Since we touched on it, your tactical tip of the day: don't overclean your guns, and especially if you are going to use an ammonia-based cleaner, be careful. You might do more damage cleaning that bore with that ammonia than just leaving it dirty. So be careful. I'm not telling you not to use ammonia cleaners, especially if you're a bench rest shooter. But ammonia eats metal, so think about why that it's a base, meaning it's got a pH of much higher than 7. Think about that and what you're doing with it, and just be, I would say, lean more on the stingy side than the liberal side with your ammonia-based cleaners. Just tactical tip of the day there. There are some pretty good, let's say, less corrosive things if you're going to use it a lot. If you're going to use it a little bit and you really need it, it can be a good thing. But I guess use sparingly. That's your tactical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day: heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about the day or the hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Watch out, stay alert, for you do not know when the appointed time is. Of course, that's good advice. It's from the creator of the universe, Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.